In this section, we'll look at Nixon's growing conservatism in domestic policy. You really see Nixon's conservatism evident in his support for law and order during the '68 campaign and in his Southern strategy to win conservative white voters in the South who traditionally voted Democratic. It was Nixon who coined the term silent majority to speak of Americans who were not protesting but advocating traditional values. So these sort of sentiments sort of grew as Nixon's presidency. They became more evident as Nixon's presidency continued. As I mentioned before, Congress had initially rejected two of Nixon's Supreme Court nominees Clement Hayesworth and Harold Carswell. The Congress argued that they were hostile to civil rights. That's what Democrats claimed. And this really ticked off Nixon and kind of moved him more towards reactionary policies. Again, the Southern strategy appealing to conservative white Southerners who traditionally voted Democratic. Nixon also proposed to reorganize completely the executive branch, completely eliminating several offices and combining others. Because the reorganization meant shifting congressional oversight, Congress largely rejected the proposals. Just before Nixon was reelected to a second term, Congress finally passed his revenue sharing bill, which was a key part of his new federalism approach, first introduced almost 3 years before. The idea for revenue sharing had first been developed by the economist Walter Heller, who'd actually worked for the Johnson White House. It was a key part of Nixon's attempt to devolve power and authority from the federal government to the state and local governments. The Revenue Sharing Bill, officially known as the State and Local Assistance Act of 1972, was simple. It provided that the federal government would collect taxes, but allocate $30.2 billion in federal revenue over a 5-year period, with $5.3 billion in the first year. 1/3 of that total money went to the state governments, and 2/3 went to the local governments. There were no matching requirements, and the state and local governments had broad discretionary power over how to spend the funds. The only real mandates the federal government put on the state and local governments that received the funds were that they had to hold public hearings on the spending, and they couldn't discriminate in the distribution of funds. A public audit was also required. Conservatives loved the idea of revenue sharing. Indeed, its administrative costs were lower for the federal government, and both of Nixon's immediate successors, Republican Gerald Ford and Democrat Jimmy Carter, continued to a degree to experiment with revenue sharing. At the same time, however, revenue sharing meant that the traditional programs the state and local governments relied on were drastically cut back. By the end of the 1970s, it was obvious that, at least to Democrats, that these cuts outstripped the revenue-sharing grants and left the poor worse off than before. So the Democrats were really complaining. As Nixon approached his second term, he increasingly worked to cut the federal budget. For example, Nixon had originally supported increased spending for environmental protection. As you can see in the short video section on Nixon's environmental record, however, he later cut the budgets for the very agencies he'd created for the environment. The same's true for other agencies and departments. In addition, Nixon refused to spend all the money that Congress had appropriated for spending, the so-called impoundment. The Constitution wasn't clear on the subject. It simply said that Congress had to appropriate all the money the president spent, not that the president had to spend all the money Congress appropriated. Now, a few presidents had impounded congressionally appropriated funds before, but Nixon went way beyond anybody before. He impounded approximately $12 billion, often for clear policy objectives counter to the intent of Congress. Nixon impounded a lot of money Congress intended for civil rights, among other goals. It all infuriated Congress and the Democrats in Congress. In 1974, after Nixon had impounded water pollution appropriations and was obviously weakened by the ongoing Watergate scandal, Congress passed the Budget and Impoundment Act of 1974, which sought to rein in president's powers. It did several things. For example, it required Congress to adopt a budget concurrent resolution. It wasn't signed by the president, but first established general limits on revenue and spending for the coming fiscal year. So everybody have to work within those confines. It created new budget committees in both the House and Senate, each to hold hearings and work through the specifics of taxing and spending bills to meet this concurrent resolution. Moreover, the law created the Congressional Budget Office, often referred to as the CBO, which was a nonpartisan agency to give fiscal advice, and it would score each proposal, that is, evaluate each bill's cost and impact. The Budget and Impoundment Act of 74 also required the president to get Congress's approval within 45 days if he wanted not to spend any appropriated money. It did allow the president some limited ability for short-term impoundment in really unusual circumstances. It also, by the way, moved the fiscal year from July 1st to October 1st. Nixon vetoed the legislation, but Congress overrode the veto, and the bill became law. The impoundment, again, the fight over impoundment really angered Congress. And at the same time, Nixon was invading Cambodia without congressional approval, and a Watergate scandal, which we'll talk about later on, was unfolding. Anyway, and all of this kind of made people talk about the Nixon administration as the, quote, imperial presidency, unquote. On January 23rd, 1973, the same day that Lyndon Johnson died, the Supreme Court issued its famous decision, Roe v. Wade, on abortion. And citing the 4th and 14th Amendment, the court spoke of a right to privacy from government intrusion, and it declared that nobody could restrict abortion in the first trimester of pregnancy. In the second trimester, the states could restrict it. In the third trimester, it would be illegal, and this was quite controversial at the time. Feminists began to complain that Nixon wasn't pushing ERA ratification. He'd said he supported it, and as I mentioned earlier, he had endorsed it and signed the bill, but when it came to getting the states to ratify it, they claimed he was not pushing it. Indeed, resistance to the Equal Rights Amendment was growing stronger in the South, where of course Nixon had focused his Southern strategy. Nixon had signed the Philadelphia Order, an early implementation of affirmative action, as I'd mentioned previously, and he professed to be a champion of civil rights. But increasingly, Nixon appealed to the critics of forced busing to implement desegregation. With the courts mandating busing, Nixon, late in his first term, demanded that Congress pass legislation to halt the process. Although Congress delayed further implementation of court-ordered busing until the end of 1973, Nixon's actions again angered civil rights advocates. It should be noted that among the many reasons that Nixon sort of drifted increasingly conservative as time passed was the growing Watergate scandal, which of course I'll discuss in another video later on. Facing possible impeachment, Nixon undoubtedly wanted to shore up his conservative support in Congress so he would survive impeachment. In any event, this concludes the section on Nixon's growing conservatism.